Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our ZFA conversation this evening. I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I speak, the Boon-Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Knowing that this conversation is being watched across Australia, I also acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which people are watching this. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce you to our special guest this evening, Yuli Edelstein MK. If I were to even try to be comprehensive about Yuli's CV, there wouldn't be enough time for the session itself, so I'll just give you a few highlights. Born in the FSU, Yuli applied to emigrate to Israel in 1979 and was refused by the Soviet authorities. As a refusnik, he was active in Zionist circles and secretly taught Hebrew. He was arrested by the KGB in 1984 on fabricated charges and imprisoned for 3 years. Released in 1987, he made Aliyah and focused on educational leadership before entering politics as one of the founders of the party Israel Ba'aliyah, a party which won 7 seats in the Knesset in 1996. Yuli was appointed as Minister of Immigration Absorption at the time of the large-scale Aliyah from the FSU, and he worked hard to promote Olim integration in every aspect of Israeli society, advocating for housing, funding, and also cultural centres for immigrant artists. In 2003, Israel Ba'aliyah joined the Likud party. In his 25 years in the Knesset, Yuli Edelstein has held a range of important ministerial and committee positions, including stints as Deputy Speaker, Minister for Public Diplomacy and Diaspora Affairs, and in 2013, he was elected as Speaker of the Knesset, which he served with distinction until 2020. In 2020, he was appointed Minister for Health, serving 13 months leading Israel's response to the most serious health crisis in its history. Tonight, we gather virtually. We're certainly not over the COVID crisis. Yuli, you might not be aware, but much of Australia is currently in a pretty harsh lockdown at the moment. And as we speak, Israel is rolling out third vaccination doses in response to their rising infection rates. Whilst the Israel-Gaza conflict of earlier this year is over, just this weekend, we've also seen an Israeli soldier wounded at the border and riots and clashes there. So there's a lot to discuss tonight. And for all of you watching on Zoom, we'd love your input. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to post your questions, and we'll do our best to put them to Mr. Edelstein. It's my great pleasure to welcome Philip Chester, former ZFA President and current ZFA Chair of Aliyah, who's going to lead the conversation tonight with Yuli Edelstein. Philip, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette, and good evening, everybody, and good afternoon, Yuli. Yuli, I'm not hearing anything from you, so perhaps we'll just wait one moment and see if you are connecting. Good afternoon.
Yeah, hard to believe. It's because you're down under, I guess. It takes time.
Yes, the wires, the cables have to go run a long way.
Exactly.
Very good to see your smiling face. How are you?
I'm fine. I just managed to find a different device and thank God it worked.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get straight into it because the time's very tight with these sessions. Jeanette has already outlined your very extensive and impressive biography, so we won't go over that again.
I hope all the details were correct.
They were very much correct and very, very, very impressive. So let me ask you the first question. You came to the Jewish world's attention, I think, the first time as a refusnik in the former Soviet Union. I understand you came from Chernovitz, which is actually my father's original name. So there's a connection there, which I found interesting. What motivated you to become a Zionist in the dark dungeon of the Soviet Union and to endure 3 years, under the oppression of the KGB in prison and then to fight to move to Israel?
Well, as you rightly mentioned, Philip, first of all, thank you for organizing the meeting. Thanks to everyone for joining. I understand we have quite an audience here. I was actually born in Chernovitz, which was my grandparents from my mother's side and my mother's hometown. A place with interesting history because as I used to explain everything about Chernovitz in one story. Many years after I was born, to be precise, 26 years after I was born, I was sent to my first labor camp in Siberia near the Mongolian frontier. And they were, I guess, worried that I would start Zionist propaganda among all the rapists and thieves and all the other guys who were there. The very nice audience, I guess, for Zionist propaganda. Obviously, none was Jewish, but they sent some high-ranking officer from the district punishment division to educate me. So I was brought to the office of the commander of the camp. That guy was sitting there, and before I managed to say Jack Robinson, he said, I can't understand someone like you. This country gave you everything. Education, work to your parents, apartment to your parents, everything one could dream of, and you become a traitor? And so what can a Jew do under these circumstances when being asked a question like that? You answer it with the question. So I said, citizen officer, that's how you have to address them. Citizen officer, I just have one question. My grandmother was born in Austria. My mother was born in Romania. I was born in the Ukraine. Whom exactly am I betraying right now? The problem is we were all born in the same hospital. So that's the story of Chernovitz, a very international and a very Jewish place. And I guess the little sparkles of something Jewish I could pick up from my grandparents in Chernovitz, though they were not religious Jews. They were not Zionists in practical terms, meaning going to Israel or something like that. But my grandfather of blessed memory decided to study Hebrew when he was 70-something years old. And after only, I have to stress, only after he passed away, I just out of love for him, and I took the books and the notebooks that he had and started studying Hebrew. I was 18 years old those days. And that was, I think, the initial stone that pushed me in the direction of Zionism. And it was also combined with the obvious lack of desire to continue living in the former Soviet Union. So these two things together brought me to the idea that I have to request what they used to call a vizov, an invitation from your imaginary relatives in Israel, and to apply for an exit visa. I did so in 79. Afghanistan is now on the news all over the world. So Afghanistan was on the news in 79, if you recall too. So the Cold War, the new round of Cold War, the boycott of Moscow Olympics, I didn't stand one chance to get an exit permit and became, as you mentioned already, Philip, a refusnik.
Okay, very interesting. We had your good friend Natan Sharansky on this lockdown learning last year. He told us a lot about how he coped for all those years in the pre-Russian prison system. How did you cope? Could not have been easy.
No, it was not easy. My sentence was much shorter than Natan's, and I was at no stage under the threat of a death sentence the way he was when he was standing trial, because he was an official traitor. I was a traitor only in the eyes of that officer, but I was a Hebrew teacher in the underground and a Jewish activist, especially cultural activities. I was not so politically active in terms of going to demonstrations or, trying to combat the regime. I decided that my best contribution could be in teaching Hebrew, teaching Yahadut, Judaism, and spreading the Jewish culture. And the authorities didn't like that idea. And they warned me in their own way several times, meaning short arrests, breaking into the apartments where I had a Hebrew class, an attempt to throw me out of Moscow, to deny me infamous Propiska, the registration, the official registration in Moscow. And when all that didn't work out well for them, they came with the search. It was in August. Actually, the date is 22, so it was August 24, 1984.
You still remember it, Yuli?
Yeah. August 24, they came with a search and planted, or at least said that they planted drugs in the apartment. And I peacefully got my 3 years of imprisonment for illegal possession of drugs, though at some stage, speaking of what was the real threat, they were trying to switch the accusation. It was very interesting. At some stage, I made a very stupid mistake. During my interrogation, I said to the interrogator, who was a simple guy, a policeman, nothing to do with KGB or Jewish activities. They were trying to keep me all the time on the level of a regular criminal. And I said to him, I just don't understand. If you don't accuse me of using drugs, you don't accuse me of selling drugs, you just accuse me of illegal possession of drugs. So what was the purpose of me keeping the drugs? For you guys to come and arrest me? What did I keep the drugs for? And it was a stupid mistake, as I've said, the beginner's mistake. And after several days, he came up to my late wife, who was very actively fighting for my release. And he said, now we know what your husband had the drugs for. And she said, well, that would be interesting to know. Why? He said, you Jews get together once a week and you all come together and you all together sniff drugs. He obviously meant Havdalah. and I guess he got some consultations where he could use the drugs and as far as Jews are concerned. We all laugh. I just saw you laughing. It's normal reaction, I understand. My late wife didn't laugh because she realized very quickly that it's one thing, illegal possession of drugs. It's a totally different ball game if they accuse me of offering the drugs to the others, getting others involved. It's up to 10 years of imprisonment. And thank God there was a big international outcry about the new Bailey's case, instead of blood label, the drug label, and so on and so forth. And it's all finished with 3 years. What helped me cope? I'll tell you, during this mock trial, which was nothing to write home about, just several hours. Are you guilty? No, I'm not guilty. Okay, all the witnesses saw that you had the drugs in your pocket. No, the witnesses are lying. So it went like that for several hours. And in the end, I was asked to give my closing remarks. So I said that I still hope that the court will see the absurdity of the accusations. But as on the other hand, I understand that it won't happen, I am pretty sure that my God and my people will help me go through that and help me reach my motherland, Israel. And that was exactly what happened. I was never alone during the imprisonment because, as once again, a simple example, my first camp was a real nightmare. It was by the Baikal Lake near the Mongolian frontier, a terrible place with hard labor in the woods. And after 11 hours outside the camp working, like this column of prisoners is walking back into the camp, dead tired. And the officer in charge of prisoners' discipline all of a sudden stops me in the middle of the camp on this plaza and says, Edelstein, come here. So I approach him and he says, I just want you to know my safe in my office is full of letters for you from all over the world, from all kinds of countries. And I'm not going to deliver to you one single letter because it's forbidden. So as you can imagine, nothing could make me more happy at that moment. And to be quite frank, and no offense meant, I was not so eager to read the letters. The letters were probably from school children, or, you know, saying, dear Mr. Edelstein, we love you very much, happy Hanukkah, and so on and so forth. But the very fact that I realized that I was getting letters from all over the world was a huge support in the camp. And the final thing was that instead of 3 years, I was released after 2 years and 8 months. It was already perestroika, and I was actually stuck because I was, well, technically the last but one, but practically the last prisoner of Zion, still stuck there for quote unquote legal reasons. I know it sounds funny, but they actually wanted to release me after 2 years. They called me to some strange committee. And after describing me as the best prisoner they've ever had, you know, so well disciplined, hardworking, never behaves with any chutzpah towards the officers, and such a wonderful guy. I couldn't understand what was going on, because for 2 years I've heard that I was the most terrible creature they've ever seen. And so in the end, the chair of the committee says, oh, just one small detail. We are so happy to hear that you are really improving, but you admit to your crimes, right? And I obviously said, no. If you mean illegal possession of drugs, I don't admit. So he said, listen, prisoner Edelstein, if you give us a different answer, we might give a different or a surprising answer to you right now. And it was quite a challenging moment, because no one prepared me for that committee. I was driven basically out of a prison hospital bed. I was rather badly injured during a working accident, and taken to that committee. And, you know, it's like in 1 second, you have to calculate everything. Speaking of decision-making process, there was no process. You have 1 second. So on one side, you have your, you know, obvious lack of desire to admit to illegal possession of drugs and things you've never committed. And on the other hand, you all of a sudden realize that you're out of the camp, your family will see you again. You can lay tefillin on your hand and your head. You can eat kosher food. You can do all kinds of things. And the price is so low. The price is so low. He didn't ask me to betray my comrades. He didn't ask me to, I don't know, to write a letter against Zionist activities. He just asked me to admit to my crimes. And I had 1 second to consider all that, and it's kind of with a lot of pressure. So I remember saying that option, I said, citizen officer, that option was with me from the very first day. When you just arrested me, I could probably the next day say, oh, I didn't mean it. I'm a good guy. I repent. I don't want anything to do with this whole Zionist movement. And probably, who knows, maybe a day later, I would be sitting with my wife drinking coffee. And all of a sudden, you know, as I've said, it's kind of stream of conscience. And I stopped for a second and I said, I just have one problem. My wife wouldn't drink coffee with a guy like that. So he cursed me all the well-known Russian curses that, you know, they use in the camp. And he said, okay, I can't quote him because I respect the audience, but said, okay, get out of here. You don't want to get released, don't be released. And the funny thing is that I totally think that was the right decision, because they never asked for my cooperation when they put me in the camp. So I remember saying then, when they really decide to release me, they wouldn't need any cooperation from my side. And who knows what kind of trap they're planning here with my little announcement. And then they will say, okay, you know, we have a camera here. We'll show you on the TV saying that you terribly regret keeping the drugs and all that stuff, or you terribly regret that the Zionists brought you into that whole mess and that whole story. And 8 months later, that's exactly what happened. Yes, the price was 8 additional months in the camp, but after 8 months, the Moscow City Court had a news sitting on my case, and they decided that though I was a criminal and I was a drug addict and whatever I was, the punishment was just a little bit too severe. So instead of 3 years, it should be 2 years and then 8 months, which was the next morning. And next morning, I was released from the camp without any cooperation from me. And a month and a half later, we're talking about 1987, a month and a half later, I already got my exit visa.
Very, very interesting. Yuli, so let's move now from the former Soviet Union to Israel. How do you believe your experience in the Soviet Union, all the things you went through, shaped your life in Israel, and how you look at the world today? I mentioned Natan again. You know, he became a warrior for democracy, published books, many speeches in that area. How has it influenced the way you looked at your life in Israel, what you wanted to do in Israel, and how you look at the world more generally?
Well, in Israel, the funny thing is that I immediately continued with the same activities as in the former Soviet Union, meaning Jewish education. I started working in one of the programs of the Sochnut for young adults from abroad coming to Israel, teaching them Hebrew. Thank God, I realized after a year or so that it's one thing to be an underground Hebrew teacher in Moscow, and it's a totally different thing to be an educator in the field of Jewish education in Israel. So I went to study for a couple of years in a program that you might have heard of called the Jerusalem Fellows. And later it became the Mandel School for Educational Leadership. So I studied there, Jewish education, obviously, Jewish education for the diaspora in particular, and then continued working in different educational institutions in Israel. And here we come to politics. I guess that's exactly the combination you're talking about. On the one hand, I wanted to continue in the field of Jewish education. On the other hand, after all those years and after this whole battle for Aliyah, I didn't think I had the privilege of just sitting by the TV set and criticizing something that is going on in Israel, that I had to get actively involved. And 93, the Oslo agreements happened. I disagreed with them wholeheartedly. I thought they were a disaster. And then I got a call from the Likud saying that they need someone to help them connect, mostly with the community of new immigrants, and they have no one, and whether I could come and help them. So I left my job in the Centers for Jewish Education in Jerusalem, and went to work with the then Likud leader and chair of the opposition, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the Likud. Things didn't work out very well there. And that was the time when Natan Sharansky and myself, after being very active through different NGOs, the Zionist Forum, decided that lobbying is very nice, but we also must think of getting political power if we really want to continue promoting Aliyah, promoting the issues dealing with the absorption, integration of new immigrants in Israel. And then we started a political party called Israel B'Aliyah. And it was interesting. It's exactly what you asked, Philip. We from the very beginning refused to say we're just a party that will, I don't know, take care of a better absorption basket for new immigrants or something like that. We wanted to express, based on our experience, our views on peace process and international relations and economy and education and all kinds of fields, because the basic assumption was it's not just taking care of the new immigrants, it's which is important enough, but also making sure that there will be contribution. If we are talking about such high numbers and high percentage of new immigrant population inside Israel, what should the contribution be to different fields of Israeli life? We were pretty successful in our first political campaign. We got 7 seats. To remind you, Israeli Knesset is 120 seats all in all, and became part of the government. So then we were running 3 times as Israel B'Aliyah before merging with the Likud, and that I think was the time when I could really bring forward all kinds of views and experience from my past vis-a-vis dictatorships, vis-a-vis different aspects of our life in Israel. So it's a long conversation. I won't go into all the details, but I think that the combination of, on one hand, being very accepting and pluralistic, because that's how we used to be when we were a Zionist and Jewish movement in the former Soviet Union. On the other hand, respecting your views and making sure that the others will also have to respect them. That was, I think, the most important lesson I learned from my camp experience, that you don't have to impose your lifestyle, your views, your ideas on all the others. I mean, it's nice when they agree, but the chances there are you won't be able to bring the whole world to think the way you do. But if you respect your views and you respect what you're standing for, the others will follow and learn, and without joining you, they will definitely respect your viewpoint. That's, I mean, I have tons of examples from the camp, but it was sometimes really touching to see how, as I've said, ordinary criminals, obviously non-Jewish, would try to help me with some food because they saw that I refused to eat certain things because of the dietary laws, because of kashrut. And they didn't understand first thing about it, or how they would try to help me not to go to work on Yom Kippur, because I said to them, look, it's not for a debate, you know. I'll either stay in the barrack or I'll go to the punishment cell. I won't go to work on Yom Kippur. So they were trying to create all kinds of explanations and excuses for me to stay in the barracks without having first idea what Yom Kippur was and why it was so important.
Thank you, Yuli. Yeah, let's bring it forward a little bit. Before you got on the line, I told our audience that one of the most moving experiences for me personally in my trips to Israel was actually visiting you in Gush Katif 3 weeks before the disengagement. You had a house there. I wanted to see what was going on, of course, with the disengagement in Gaza, and to meet you and to just see how you felt about the whole thing. It was I don't know how you saw it. Obviously, you were much closer to me, but it was quite surreal, but also sad and tense and all sorts of things at the one time. There were very good reasons for the disengagement on one level. The Jewish boys and girls in the army were dying, and there was a lot of violence, and there was the Israeli society in a way had enough of it. But on the other hand, it took a great toll, uprooting the Jewish population. How do you see it today? You know, we haven't solved the Gaza problem, no, not even close. What's your perspective with hindsight now about what happened then and how you see it today?
Well, first of all, I do remember you bumping in. I moved actually to a small moshav called Gadid there in the Gush. You know, it's about putting your money where your mouth is. I was a strong opponent of the unilateral withdrawal, of the disengagement. And at some stage I said, you know, it's one thing to just demonstrate and speak in the plenary session of the Knesset, but on the other hand, it's very important to be with these people who definitely didn't do anything wrong. And many of them really couldn't understand why the heck they're being removed, because, you know, it was very difficult even then to understand the real motives. And now you ask me what or how I see it right now. Our advisors always teach us, I mean elected officials, to never say, I told you so. but I can't resist the temptation. I say, I told you so. Everything we were saying about unilateral withdrawal and its terrible results has been happening for the last 15 years. And some of us, I guess, were too optimistic. I do recall that we were talking about missiles falling on Ashkelon and Ashdod. I don't recall we were talking about missiles from Gaza falling on Rishon LeZion or Tel Aviv. I think that that kind of doom prophecy was too strong in for us. So the results haven't been reached, and they couldn't be reached through unilateral withdrawal. It was, as I've said, a very naive, childish even attempt to pretend that if we are not in Gaza, Gaza would disappear and won't bother us. It's bothering us well. And as you know, speaking of boys and girls, we now have a police officer, what we call the Mishmar HaGvul officer,
Border police.
The border police officer in a serious condition, very serious condition. He was injured yesterday by the fence of Gaza. So as I've said, speaking of experiences, it's always good to be optimistic, but you also have to be realistic. You just can't pretend that if you withdraw, things will work out by themselves. And I already made a point about Afghanistan being on the news. So it's more or less the same mistakes. Obviously, if you leave a certain territory that you've been controlling, why the heck could you presume that the bad guys, the negative forces, wouldn't take control of it? And that's exactly what happened in Gaza. There is no quick solution for that. And I think that the results of the unilateral withdrawal will be felt here in this area for many more years to come. And by the way, I'm not saying that with any blaming or accusing tone. I'm to blame too. I knew everything. I could foresee what was going on. And as an elected official, I didn't manage to explain to the majority of the Israelis how problematic that whole story was. So I'm to blame too. I'm taking part of the responsibility for not being able to, for not being strong enough, for not being eloquent enough, for not being heavyweight enough to explain the things that were so obvious to me, and to let the others control the message and explain that things would become just wonderful after we quit and after we leave the Gaza Strip.
Yuli, Jeanette announced in your introduction that for a number of years you were either the deputy speaker or the speaker of the Knesset, very important position in the Israeli political system. And you were a great advocate for increasing the standing of the Knesset, the prestige, the influence of the Knesset within Israeli society. It's no secret, I think, among us here tonight that the Israeli political system has been not operating perhaps as well as it could have. All the hung elections, which couldn't produce a result, paralyzed the country for such a long period of time. Of course, now we have a national unity government, a very broadly based government. You're in the opposition, in the Likud. What's your assessment of the system? Are the issues that paralyze the country about the structure of the political system? Is it about Israeli society itself? Is it something else? And what do you see as the way to ensure this type of paralysis doesn't continue in the future?
Well, they say a well-posed question always includes the answer. So that's exactly what happened. I think that the problems we're talking about are much deeper. They're not in the political system. You mentioned that for 7 years I served as a speaker of the Knesset, and before that, deputy speaker and the minister. So in all my positions, I'm trying to be consistent, and I'm saying that this whole idea of quickly, rapidly changing the political system and then everything will work out is ill-based. I think that you know, I'll give you an example with a smile. As you know, Canada is a great country, and they even don't have the Gaza Strip next to them. And still, you know, if you would follow early elections and minority governments and all kinds of things. I remember a speaker of the Knesset hosting a big delegation from Canada that actually included all the representatives, at least, or I even think faction leaders from all the factions in the parliament. And they were very excited because they explained to me the electoral reform that they were planning. It never happened, but never mind. At that time, they had a committee on the electoral reform. And I was very interested and said, yeah, we have our own issues. So what exactly is your direction? And they gave me one-to-one the whole Israeli system. They'll get rid of the writings. They'll get rid of these personal elections of members of Knesset. They'll run the proportional representation system, exactly the Israeli model. So I guess it's always, you know, a nice trend, you know, for us to think of direct elections through writings and for them to think of proportional representation. The problems are much deeper. Yes, there are things you can improve in the political system in Israel, but I think we already tried that through, if you recall, the direct elections of the prime minister. The idea was now we'll have a strong prime minister that wouldn't be dependent on minor parties. What happened was the exact opposite, a more fragmented Knesset that never, by the way, came back to the situation of two big parties. I can only react with a smile to what you said, that there's a broad-based unity government right now. This broad-based government is based on 61 members of Knesset out of 120. So the very fact that it's broad, meaning consisting of 8 factions, doesn't add to the stability, or rather the exact opposite. So I'm not sure that this kind of stability can be reached through this or that change in the political system. We have to think in a much broader way, and the processes, I think, they don't necessarily lie in the Knesset. They are outside the Knesset, and what we see as our common vision for the future, not just the political combination of something that even during my days was considered not done, like, you know, buying a member of Knesset here, giving a portfolio to a member of Knesset there, and thus balancing your government. This is not the way to run a country like Israel with all the challenges that we are facing all the time.
So leading on from that, for the first time, we've seen an Arab party as part of the government. I think everyone would agree that it's a dramatic change. There'd never been the situation before. I think actually it was Prime Minister Netanyahu who first broached the idea. So I guess in opposition, in theory, you can't complain about it. How do you see that? Do you see that as a positive for Israel moving forward in terms of integrating all of its citizens into the political process? Do you think it has dangers which may be difficult to overcome? What's your assessment?
It's the immediate continuation of my previous answer. In terms of our future vision, definitely integration of the Arab Israeli citizens is very important. And we can't afford in a country like Israel a situation where there will be, you know, a separate country for the Arabs, a separate country for ultra-Orthodox, a separate country for this, and a separate country for that. We must think of real integration as far as social values, labor market, everything is concerned. That's obvious. You know, in my last position, in my capacity as health minister, you know, that was part of the very serious problem, how you first run all the lockdowns and other unpleasant things through different communities that don't feel really affiliated, don't want to take quote unquote marching orders from the government. And then with the vaccination campaign, how you infiltrate these communities. So definitely for very good practical reasons, integration is very important. And for ideological reasons, if you want to keep Israel as a normal democratic country, it's very important too. This is the positive side. The negative side is we are talking not just, it's even like a little bit offensive to say an Arab party. We are talking about the Islamic movement. There are different Arab parties. Arabs are not all the same. There are communists in the Knesset. There are Islamists in the Knesset. There are, Kamal Abdel Nasser types, pan-Arabic nationalists in the Knesset. There are different approaches on different political platforms among the Arab members of the Knesset, and there are several Arab members of the Knesset in the other bigger Israeli parties. So I wouldn't bet on the Islamic movement as a very good partner for future integration of the Arab community. I think they have a totally different vision, and I'm not sure that at this stage, except for, as I've said, giving the political balancing to the present government, the presence of the Islamic movement, of the Israeli Islamic movement in today's coalition, they're not in the government technically, they're in the coalition, leads us to better integration of Arab citizens, maybe even vice versa.
Okay, very interesting. You mentioned Corona, and we can't have an evening of discussion without talking about Corona. And you were the Minister of Health. Perhaps that was your most challenging tafkid during the dark days last year. As Jeanette, you wouldn't have heard us say, a lot of Australia is currently in lockdown, if you can believe it. Millions and millions of people. We're under a curfew here in Melbourne and Sydney. We can't go out for more than an hour to exercise. We can't go out for lots of things. We have to work from home. And we have less than 1,000 cases in all of Australia and very, very few deaths, as you know. Israel, as I last looked, had about 6,000 infections yesterday. And yet, as I understand it, life's proceeding pretty normally at the moment. You had responsibility. You don't today, but you did for a lot of the period of Corona in Israel. How do you assess the way Israel dealt with the pandemic, is dealing with it today, and is the issue perhaps in dealing with the pandemic more about politics than it is about health?
I would say that first of all, politics is always present. It's I'll give you one example. Corona is a very strange creature, and there were, for example, periods of time that in the Arab sector there was a terrible surge in numbers, and in the rest of the country there wasn't. And there were times during my times as health minister, I'm talking about statistics, not about what I like or don't like. There were times when the ultra-Orthodox community was suffering from a terrible surge in numbers and the rest of the country was not. You said, is it about politics? It's always about politics. Could you really presume that I, as health minister, could demand from the government to put curfew and lockdown on the Arab sector in Israel and the rest of the country, could walk free? Epidemiologically, that's what I had to do. Politically, you always have to take these things into consideration. So I'm not suggesting that because of a certain group of population, you have to put a lockdown on the whole country. But you always have to take these things into consideration. That's something that you have to face and you have to always look at. And otherwise, you don't need political leadership. I had the best professionals in the world in the health ministry. I always listened to their advice. My position was to say during these meetings when we were getting ready for the government meetings, for the cabinet meetings, was to say, listen, with all the due respect, these things weren't passed through the government, they weren't passed through the Knesset. We have to make sure that we bring proposals that are, implementable and doable. So that was the political vis-a-vis health part. In terms of Israel dealing with the coronavirus, I would say we are obviously talking about two different periods of time. One before the vaccine and the other one after the vaccine. Before the vaccine, no one, including even a smart guy like me, couldn't create anything else except for all the usual measures, social distancing and lockdown when necessary, and all kinds of restrictions. That's how it worked. We went through two difficult waves without the vaccines, and that's how we managed to survive those waves. Then December 2020, we started the vaccination. The Prime Minister and myself got the first vaccines, and there was a wonderful response from the population. We are right now with about 6 million out of 9 million strong population of Israel vaccinated, and in the population that is not vaccinated, we are talking about children who are not eligible to get the vaccine, children under the age of 12 yet. And we are talking about those for medical reasons can't get the vaccines. And yes, we are talking about the anti-vaxxers who refuse to take the vaccine. So it's a totally different game right now. And I don't think that it's necessary to come with lockdowns when the country is vaccinated. But yes, you have to play very carefully. When you see a certain surge in numbers, you have to react quickly with things that are let's say with conventional weapon. You don't have to talk immediately about non-conventional weapons. Conventional weapon being the Green Pass and probably some restrictions as far as massive gatherings are concerned, or concerts or things of that kind. It can take you through the waves. Now we are dealing with a different variant. The vaccine is, I think, less resistant to this variant. It doesn't. It's not that it doesn't work, but it's less effective as far as this new variant is concerned. So that's how you have to play all the time. And yes, Philip, not of late and not through the last year. I don't think that in 25 years of my political life, I had such a challenging position as the health minister during the coronavirus. It's really running a national crisis. It's facing protesters next to your house from the morning till the evening, practically every day. Some of them that you don't care about, as I've said, anti-vaxxers and all this stuff. But some are good people who can't understand how come that for the third time you are closing, I don't know, the fitness centers or cultural events or things of that kind. They're good people. They come to protest. You have to talk to them. You have to try to explain. And it's quite an experience. But what is really heartwarming, that after that terrible year and after the difficult year and after all the challenges, when the government stepped down, they ran a poll on the main news channel about the grades, the marks that the Israeli public gives to different ministers. And I was, politicians like to boast. So I will boast and say that mine were the highest. So I guess that when you look people into the eyes and tell them what you feel, and you are trying to explain the necessity of the steps that you are making, of the measures you are taking, they may be angry, they may disagree in some cases, but they know at least that it's not just something that is, as you said, it's not just a political game, it's something that may be life-saving.
Yuli, we're running out of time, which is very unfortunate. There's a lot of questions from the audience. So I'm going to make it hard for you. I'm going to give you 90 seconds to answer 2 questions. So it's concise, but give us what you think. One is the implications of the withdrawal of Afghanistan and Taliban re-entrance for Israel. And number 2, is Bibi still have an ironclad, if you like, control of the Likud party, both from the audience.
Yep. Taliban and Afghanistan, you know, it's all, everything is in this modern world, everything is connected. So definitely when the terror organization, an army, whatever you call them, the Taliban, so easily get control and enjoy the withdrawal of the international, especially American forces from there, it influences all their soulmates here in the area. Gives inspiration to all the terrorist groups, Hezbollah, Hamas, you name it, you know, shows them that if they persist and if they fight, they could reach their goals, which is psychologically difficult. There's no practical implementations in the immediate sense of the word because Israel anyway had no connections to Afghanistan. We were not on the ground there, we didn't have an embassy there. So I think more about, we're talking about psychological warfare, psychological influence here in the area. In terms of the Likud, it remains to be seen. Sooner or later, there will be primary elections for the leadership, and then we'll see who will be elected, the next or the same leader, or whatever the case might be. We don't have a date for primary elections yet, but sooner or later it will come.
You're still a good politician, Yuli. Very, very diplomatic and political answer to that last question. Okay.
25 years of experience.
Thank you very much. It's been wonderful talking to you. All the best, and I'll hand over to Jeanette to sum up.
Thank you very much, Philip, and many, many thanks to you, Yuli, for sharing your personal stories and your insights in this very fascinating and very wide-ranging conversation that took us from the Soviet Union in the 80s to Israel today and to the pressing global issues of Afghanistan and COVID, all in less than 60 minutes. Thank you to everybody on Zoom tonight for your attention and your participation this evening. Unfortunately, we could not get through all the questions you posed on chat, and I'm sure you had more that you would have liked to have asked. And it was really quite inevitable that we wouldn't have been able to do that, because this is a conversation that could have gone so much longer. The video of tonight's session will appear soon on the ZFA's YouTube channel for you to watch again, to send to your friends, and of course, to continue the conversation in the comments section. In just over 2 weeks, we'll be celebrating Rosh Hashanah. And on behalf of the Zionist Federation of Australia, I wish you all Shana Tova Umetuka, wherever you are in the world, and in whatever way you are permitted to mark the Chag and to celebrate, whether it's with family, only your nuclear family, with your extended family, if you're somewhere lucky enough to be able to do that. I wish you a year of sweetness, and most importantly, a healthy and a safe year. Thank you all very much, Philip, Yuli, many, many thanks. Good night.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Thank you. Good night.